Living in the first half of the 18th century must have felt like the world was becoming smaller for the first time. Accurate maps, engines, and any fast way of crossing an ocean still did not exist. Even so, European empires were already beginning to treat entire seas as extensions of their borders. Spain controlled much of the Americas, ports throughout the Caribbean, and trade routes connecting American mines to markets in Europe and Asia. It was a network of silver, goods, ships, and fortresses built over centuries. To Madrid, this system was private property. To London, it was a locked door, and historically, the British had never shown much respect for locked doors. In 1713, after the War of the Spanish Succession, Britain secured several concessions, allowing it to trade within Spanish America. The most important was the so-called Asiento de Negros, a contract granting the British South Sea Company the right to supply enslaved Africans to the Spanish colonies. The agreement also permitted Britain to send one merchant ship per year. One ship. British merchants interpreted that limit with the same respect they usually showed Spanish law. Cargo was transferred in secret, voyages exceeded what the agreement permitted, and contraband began circulating throughout the colonies. Spain had opened a narrow commercial gap. The British tried to push an entire warehouse through it. Spanish coast guards began boarding ships, confiscating goods, and questioning crews. To the Spanish, every British vessel might be trying to break their colonial monopoly. To the British, every inspection was an insult to their flag, and more importantly, to their profits. In 1731, one of these inspections involved Robert Jenkins, the captain of a British merchant ship. According to his account, the Spanish accused his crew of smuggling and cut off part of one of his ears. The incident was brought before Parliament years later and transformed into a symbol of Spanish brutality against British sailors. In 1739, the two countries entered a conflict that would receive one of the strangest names in history, the War of Jenkins' Ear. It sounds funny. Historically, it wasn't. The ear helped turn a dispute over markets into patriotic outrage, because defending the honor of a British sailor sounded much better than, "We want a share of Spain's profits." To attack the Spanish in the Pacific, Britain first had to reach them, and there was one obstacle in the way: the entire continent of South America. Before the Panama Canal existed, a European ship trying to reach the continent's west coast had two options: sail around the other side of the world or travel down the entire Atlantic, round Cape Horn, and then sail north again through the Pacific. On a map, it looked like a simple turn at the southern tip of the Americas. To an 18th century sailor, it was a region of violent winds, waves arriving from different directions, and currents capable of pushing a ship off course for days. And all of it had to be crossed under sail. If the wind blew from the wrong direction, there was no engine to compensate. A ship could spend weeks struggling to make progress while cold, moisture, and scurvy worked their way through the crew. Navigation also depended on incomplete information. Latitude could be calculated by observing the sun or the stars, when the sky allowed it. Longitude was far more difficult. To estimate their position, sailors threw a piece of wood overboard attached to a knotted rope. While the wood remained in the water, a small hourglass measured the time as the men counted how many knots passed through their hands. This gave them the ship's approximate speed. They then combined that speed with the direction shown by the compass and tried to calculate how far they had traveled from their last known position. It was basically a GPS powered by rope, an hourglass, and a concerning amount of confidence. Small errors accumulated over several weeks could place the ship dozens or even hundreds of miles away from where it appeared to be on the chart. In 1740, all that ambition took shape in an expedition commanded by Commodore George Anson. His mission was to round Cape Horn, enter the Pacific, attack Spanish ports and ships, and disrupt colonial trade. If the opportunity arose, Anson was also expected to capture the Manila Galleon, which carried some of the most valuable cargo on the planet between Asia and the Americas. It was such an ambitious mission that crossing one of the most dangerous stretches of ocean in the world was treated as nothing more than the journey to work. The squadron consisted of 6 warships, 2 support vessels, and approximately 1,900 men. The flagship was HMS Centurion, armed with 60 guns. Among the smaller vessels was HMS Wager. Curiously, the name Wager seemed almost like a warning. Sending an aging merchant ship loaded with supplies through the Drake Passage was, quite literally, a gamble. The Wager had originally been built as a merchant ship for the East India Company. In 1739, she was purchased by the Royal Navy, converted for military service, and classified as a 6th-rate warship armed with 28 guns. But her primary role was not to confront large Spanish warships. The Wager was essentially a floating supply truck, carrying weapons, ammunition, equipment, and provisions needed to sustain the rest of the squadron throughout the campaign. The crossing would have been difficult even for a well-prepared ship. The British Admiralty found ways to make it worse. The expedition needed experienced sailors and soldiers in good physical condition, but the Royal Navy was at war, and men like that were in demand across every fleet. To fill the vacancies, many sailors were forcibly recruited, some shortly after returning from previous voyages. The military contingent was also incomplete. As a solution, the Admiralty turned to pensioners and disabled veterans from the Royal Hospital Chelsea, elderly or physically weakened men who were no longer considered fit for ordinary military service. The problem was not a lack of courage. Many were experienced veterans, but their bodies had already endured more campaigns than they should have. Meanwhile, the Wager was loaded with weapons, ammunition, maintenance equipment, provisions, and supplies intended for the rest of the squadron. The more cargo entered the hold, the lower the hull sat in the water, and the more slowly the ship responded to commands. The vessel assigned to solve the expedition's logistical problems was having its ability to sail compromised by the logistics themselves. Preparations also fell months behind schedule. The squadron departed Spithead on September 18, 1740, and did not reach the waters around Cape Horn until March 1741, when the Southern Hemisphere summer was already ending and conditions were beginning to deteriorate. Before the squadron reached the Drake Passage, the Wager's first captain, Dandy Kidd, died after falling ill. Command passed to David Cheap, who had previously served as lieutenant aboard the small vessel Trial. Cheap was already in command when the ships began rounding the southern tip of South America in March 1741. By then, scurvy was spreading throughout the squadron. The disease weakened the men just as the storms required them to work continuously on the sails, pumps, and repairs. The fewer healthy sailors remained, the more work fell on them, and the faster they too became sick. When the squadron entered the Drake Passage, the Wager began suffering a series of failures. One wave swept across the deck and destroyed several of the ship's boats. Then, a violent roll snapped the mizzenmast, located near the stern and important for maintaining balance and assisting with changes in direction. The metal fittings supporting the other masts also began to fail. Ropes came loose, the hull strained under the force of the waves, and the men carried out repairs while the ship continued to take a beating. The carpenter John Cummins, responsible for keeping the Wager intact, was temporarily aboard HMS Gloucester. The sea became too rough for him to return. The ship was beginning to come apart, and the one man professionally responsible for preventing that was trapped aboard another vessel. When Cummins finally managed to return, he improvised a replacement for the mizzenmast using a spare spar intended for the sails. The repair allowed the Wager to continue, but it did not restore her maneuverability. More storms struck Anson's squadron. The Wager was forced to cut loose and abandon one of her main anchors to relieve pressure on the foremast. Each new failure reduced her speed, and the ship began to fall behind. During one of the storms, the Wager lost sight of the rest of the squadron. She was now alone, badly damaged and carrying a crew largely incapacitated by scurvy. The support ship had become the ship most in need of support. The overcast sky prevented astronomical observations, and charts of the coastline were incomplete. Cheap believed the ship was farther west, in open water. In reality, the Wager was being driven toward the Chilean coast. John Bulkeley, the ship's gunner, began warning that they were dangerously close to land and argued that they should change course to the west. Cheap insisted on continuing toward Socorro Island, where he hoped to reunite with the squadron and resume the mission. By that point, the Wager had lost a mast, an anchor, several boats, contact with the squadron, and any certainty about her position. The only thing that remained intact was Cheap's confidence in the orders he had received. On the afternoon of May 13, 1741, land was sighted to the west and northwest. That was a troubling detail, because David Cheap believed the Chilean coast was still somewhere to the east. The Wager was not simply approaching the continent. Without realizing it, she had entered the Gulf of Panas, an enormous bay that was almost entirely absent from British charts. Dead reckoning had placed the ship in open water. South America disagreed. Every man still capable of working was called on deck to help turn the ship around. During the maneuver, Cheap fell down the quarterdeck ladder, dislocated his shoulder, and had to be carried below. The Wager was now surrounded by uncharted land, caught in a storm and temporarily without her captain. At 4:30 a.m. on May 14th, the hull struck a series of submerged rocks. The impacts destroyed the tiller and opened leaks in the lower compartments. Unable to control the rudder, the men tried to steer the ship using only the sails. It worked for several hours, which, under the circumstances, already qualified as a major triumph of British engineering. Later that morning, the Wager struck the rocks again and ran aground near the Guayaneco archipelago. Water flooded the lower decks, where some of the weakened crewmen were unable to escape. The others began abandoning the ship in small boats. Around 145 men survived the wreck and made it ashore, but reaching land had solved only their most immediate problem. Every other problem began at that moment. They had landed on an uninhabited island in the Guayaneco archipelago at the beginning of winter. The terrain consisted of rocks, bogs, and stunted forests, battered by almost constant rain. There was no settlement, no harbor, and no reason to believe that a ship would simply happen to pass through the area. The only abundant resource was still the Wager herself. As long as the hull remained trapped on the rocks, the men could return to recover food, weapons, sails, timber, and tools. The ship was no longer a means of transportation. It had become the island's only supply depot. But before the evacuation was even complete, part of the crew broke into the liquor stores and the officers' quarters. Men began drinking, looting, and fighting over whatever could still be removed from the ship. The following day, the hull collapsed even further, bringing most salvage operations to an end. The British had crossed the Atlantic to plunder the Spanish. So far, however, the only ship they had managed to loot was their own. Naval discipline survived the wreck for less time than the ship itself. David Cheap still tried to reorganize the survivors and establish a camp. Sails were turned into tents, pieces of the hull became shelters, and barrels were used to collect rainwater. Before long, a small makeshift village had appeared. The provisions recovered from the Wager were placed under strict rationing. David Cheap knew that distributing them generously would ease the hunger for a few days and doom everyone soon afterward. The supplies were therefore locked away and issued in small portions. As the provisions began to run low, the survivors searched for food at low tide. They gathered shellfish and a type of long seaweed that had to be boiled for hours. Sometimes they mixed it with flour and tallow scraped from candles to make small cakes. The Wager had set sail carrying provisions for an entire squadron. Now her men were scraping seaweed from the rocks for dinner. They also found wild celery, a source of vitamin C, and the symptoms of scurvy that had plagued them for days began to ease. The plants provided enough vitamin C to fight the disease, but almost no calories to keep them alive. Among the survivors was John Byron, a 17-year-old midshipman. He would later become a vice admiral and the grandfather of the poet Lord Byron. Decades later, he published a detailed account of what had happened on the island. John Byron found a dog belonging to the indigenous people who traveled through the channels of the region. The animal stayed near his shelter and searched for shellfish whenever the tide went out. As conditions grew increasingly desperate, several survivors took the dog for food. Byron had formed a bond with the animal and tried to stop them, but he could not. The original 145 survivors were eventually reduced to around 100, primarily because of the lack of food. By then, the provisions represented more than survival. Whoever controlled the food controlled the camp. Aboard ship, Cheap's authority came from his rank. On the island, it came from the key to the food store. This was the point when the naval disaster turned into a labor dispute conducted by armed men, stranded on an island with almost nothing to eat. In the 18th century Royal Navy, an officer's commission was tied to the ship to which he had been appointed. Sailors' wages also stopped accruing once the vessel was declared lost. The moment a crew needed discipline most was precisely the moment the Crown stopped paying them. To part of the crew, if the Wager no longer existed and the Crown had stopped paying them, David Cheap no longer had any authority. The ship was gone. Their wages were gone. Only Cheap's authority, according to Cheap, was still functioning. Cheap saw the situation differently. The military mission still existed, the war against Spain continued, and those men remained members of the Royal Navy. The crew began using this ambiguity as an argument. Obeying Cheap was now a choice, not an obligation. Before deciding whether to mutiny, however, the men had to resolve an even stranger question. Was it possible to mutiny against a captain who might no longer have a ship to command? With his authority in question, David Cheap ordered the provisions secured, maintained the divisions of rank, and tried to recreate on the island the same hierarchy that had existed aboard the Wager. The survivors built 18 shelters, a small street, and even a makeshift hospital. The bell recovered from the ship was rung to announce meals and meetings. Gradually, the camp began to resemble a small naval community. Officers, sailors, and soldiers remained housed in separate groups. Cheap occupied his own shelter, accompanied by his servant and the men he still considered loyal. Aboard ship, this separation reflected the normal order of rank. On the island, it made the captain seem increasingly distant from his crew. With every order they ignored, the sailors realized that no authority was going to appear from the other side of the island to punish them. The Royal Navy was thousands of miles away. Its local presence had been reduced to an injured captain trying to govern a beach. All that remained was for a single confrontation to make the dispute irreversible. It would begin with a young man named Henry Cousins. Henry Cousins was a young midshipman and a well-known figure in the camp. He was considered mild-mannered when sober, but in the previous weeks, Cousins had become involved in several disputes. He had been detained for insulting Cheap, argued with the surgeon, and defied several orders. On June 10, 1741, during the distribution of provisions, Cousins argued with Thomas Harvey, the man responsible for the supplies. Harvey accused him of starting a mutiny, drew a pistol, and fired. A sailor knocked the weapon aside, and the shot missed Cousins. Cheap heard the gunshot, emerged from his shelter armed, and found Cousins unarmed. Instead of asking what had happened, he shot him. Cousins died on June 24th, 2 weeks after the confrontation. In trying to prevent a mutiny that did not yet exist, Cheap gave the crew the best possible reason to organize one. Until then, the men had debated whether they still had to obey him. After Cousins died, they began discussing how to remove him. The camp split into two factions. On one side was David Cheap, still determined to carry out the expedition's orders. On the other was John Bulkeley, the Wager's gunner, who had earned the trust of most of the survivors. Their only hope of getting everyone off the island rested on the largest boat salvaged from the wreck. Originally about 40 feet long, it could not carry even half the men. Bulkeley likely called his men together and said, "We have nearly 100 men wanting to leave this island and a boat that won't hold even half of them. Make it bigger." Under the direction of the carpenter John Cummins, the boat was cut in half, lengthened by approximately 13 feet, and fitted with a makeshift deck. The new vessel was named the Speedwell. While Cummins worked, Cheap and Bulkeley argued over where they should sail. Cheap wanted to head north, reach Socorro Island, and attempt to reunite with Anson's squadron. He still believed they could reach the Spanish positions, capture an enemy vessel, and continue the original mission. For much of the crew, that meant traveling hundreds of miles in improvised boats just to return to a war that, for them, had not even begun. Bulkeley proposed heading south, passing through the Strait of Magellan, returning to the Atlantic, and then sailing to Portuguese Brazil. It was a much longer route, but it ended in friendly territory, where they could obtain assistance and find passage back to England. Neither option was safe. As the Speedwell was being built, Bulkeley kept a detailed journal and began collecting signatures in support of the route through the Strait of Magellan. He knew escaping the island would solve only half the problem. If he returned to England after abandoning his captain, he would still have to explain to the Admiralty why it had not been a mutiny. Bulkeley was preparing two vessels, the Speedwell to cross the ocean and a stack of documents to survive the court-martial. Once the Speedwell was ready, Bulkeley presented Cheap with a document supporting the route through the Strait of Magellan. Dozens of men backed the plan, but the captain continued to refuse to abandon his attempt to sail north. Bulkeley realized that a vote would not solve the problem. Cheap was still the highest-ranking officer and could simply declare everyone involved a mutineer. So Bulkeley collected signatures, recorded the events, and persuaded Lieutenant Robert Baines to formally assume command of the escape. Baines's participation was essential. Bulkeley was only the ship's gunner. Placing a lieutenant at the head of the group allowed them to present the action as a transfer of command, rather than ordinary sailors seizing power. On October 9, 1741, armed men entered Cheap's shelter, restrained the captain, and placed him under arrest for the death of Henry Cousins. It was a mutiny, but a mutiny supported by documents, signatures, and a chain of command. British bureaucracy had survived the shipwreck in excellent condition. Bulkeley was not simply trying to take control of the island. He was already building the defense he intended to present if he ever reached England. His version was that Cheap had lost his legitimacy, endangered the group, and committed a crime. Arresting him, therefore, was an act of protection, not rebellion. The original plan was to take Cheap with them as a prisoner, but placing the captain aboard an overcrowded schooner, surrounded by the men who had removed him from command, could create another power struggle in the middle of the ocean. Cheap ultimately refused to leave under those conditions. For Bulkeley, the decision was extremely convenient. He could record that he had offered the captain a place, and that Cheap had chosen to remain on the island. On October 13th, the Speedwell was launched. The following day, the schooner and two smaller boats departed carrying 81 men. Cheap, the surgeon, and a small group remained behind. The survivors had finally found a way to leave the island. After 5 months of trying to survive together, the ocean seemed less dangerous than the beach. From this point on, the story divides into two survival journeys unfolding at the same time. Bulkeley and 81 men would head south, attempting to cross the Strait of Magellan and return to the Atlantic. Cheap would remain on Wager Island with a small group, still determined to travel north and re-establish contact with Anson's squadron. Neither group knew whether its chosen route could actually lead them home. The 81 men did not leave aboard the Speedwell alone. The makeshift schooner was accompanied by a barge and a cutter, which would be used to reach shore, search for food, and collect water. Even divided among 3 vessels, there was barely enough room. Aboard the Speedwell, the men remained packed together for hours, exposed to rain and waves. They carried enough provisions for approximately 2 weeks. The voyage would last more than 3 months. Before departing, Bulkeley drafted a new set of rules. Any food they found had to be divided equally, regardless of rank. Anyone caught stealing provisions could be left ashore. 2 days after their departure, the sails were damaged. The barge had to return to Wager Island for more canvas and never managed to rejoin the Speedwell. John Byron and several others used the opportunity to return to Cheap's group. The Speedwell and the cutter continued alone. On the night of November 6th, the tow line connecting the cutter came loose. The small boat disappeared, taking one of the men with it. Without an auxiliary boat, the sailors could no longer simply row ashore in search of food or water. They had to swim to the rocks through freezing water, then return carrying whatever they had managed to find. 2 days later, 11 men were put ashore to lighten the vessel. Bulkeley recorded in his journal that they had asked to remain behind and signed a document confirming their decision. Bulkeley seemed incapable of leaving anyone behind without first obtaining the person's signature. The Speedwell might have been short on space and food, but it was never short on paperwork. Around 60 men continued toward the Strait of Magellan. Bulkeley navigated primarily using an account of John Narborough's expedition, conducted more than 70 years earlier. The book described the channels, islands, and landmarks encountered during that earlier voyage through the region. In other words, Bulkeley was attempting to navigate one of the most difficult waterways on Earth with an old book as his primary navigational instrument. The Speedwell entered the Strait of Magellan, surrounded by mountains, narrow passages, and rapidly shifting currents. In some sections, the men could advance only by rowing. In others, the wind erased several days of progress within a matter of hours. Whenever the weather allowed, groups went ashore to search for water, shellfish, or animals. Whatever food they found was divided into small portions. On December the 12th, nearly 2 months after their departure, the Speedwell reached Cape Virgenes and finally emerged from the Strait of Magellan. They had returned to the Atlantic, but were still at the southernmost edge of the continent. The hardest part of the route was theoretically behind them. The group began traveling north along the Patagonian coast, stopping whenever possible to search for food and water. The Speedwell leaked, responded poorly to the helm, and required constant repairs. Bulkeley had given the boat a remarkably optimistic name. By that point, optimism was one of the few things that did not need to be rationed. On January 14, 1742, the schooner approached a bay near present-day Mar del Plata. 8 men swam ashore to search for water and hunt. While they were on land, the Speedwell returned to sea without them. Bulkeley claimed that the wind and currents had carried the vessel away, making any attempt to return impossible. Bulkeley would have to explain his decision in front of the very people he had recorded as lost. The Speedwell continued north with only 33 men. After a brief stop at a Portuguese outpost near the Rio de la Plata, she resumed the voyage. On January 28, 1742, after 15 weeks and more than 1,200 miles, the vessel reached Rio Grande in southern Brazil. Local residents provided the new arrivals with food, clothing, and shelter. Of the 81 men who had left Wager Island, only around 30 reached Rio Grande aboard the Speedwell. Bulkeley had proved that his route was possible. He still had to prove that the decisions he made along the way were defensible. On the beach near present-day Mar del Plata, the 8 men were left without shelter, a boat, or any settlement nearby. According to them, Bulkeley had deliberately sailed away to reduce the number of people consuming the last of the provisions. Today, that coastline is lined with hotels and tourist beaches. In 1742, room service consisted of hunting sea lions for dinner. For approximately a month, the men remained at Freshwater Bay. To conserve ammunition, they tried to kill the animals with stones. Every shot they saved might be needed later. Their goal was to reach Buenos Aires, nearly 300 miles to the north. On their first attempt, they covered around 60 miles in 2 days, but found no water and were forced to turn back. A second attempt also failed, this time because they ran out of food. The men built a cabin and waited for the rainy season. They managed to raise a few pigs and tame dogs they found in the area. The camp was beginning to look permanent. At one point, they spotted animals they described as a tiger and a lion. They were probably a jaguar and a puma. Their presence helped convince the men that remaining there was not a solution either. One day, while part of the group was out hunting, 2 men stayed behind to guard the camp. When the others returned, they found the cabin destroyed, their belongings taken, and both men dead. 2 others who had gone out were missing. Their dogs returned alone. Only 4 remained: Isaac Morris, Samuel Cooper, John Andrews, and John Duck. They resumed their journey toward Buenos Aires, accompanied by 16 dogs and 2 pigs. They reached the area near the Rio de la Plata, but the marshes of Samborondón Bay blocked their path. After covering nearly the entire distance, they were forced to turn back. Soon afterward, they encountered a group of Tehuelche people and were taken captive. Over the following months, they passed between several groups before reaching the chief Cangabol. When he learned that the men were British and that Great Britain was at war with Spain, he began treating them better. An English merchant living in Montevideo learned of the survivors and paid for the release of 3 of them. Kangapol refused to release John Duck, who remained with the group. His eventual fate is unknown. Morris, Cooper, and Andrews finally reached Buenos Aires, but as British subjects found in Spanish territory during a war, they were arrested. After surviving the wreck of the Wager, abandonment, repeated attempts to cross the coast, and more than a year in captivity, they had reached civilization only to become prisoners of war. The 3 men were later transferred to the Spanish ship Asia, taken to Europe, and once again held in custody. They did not reach London until July 5, 1746. Bulkeley had returned to England 3.5 years earlier and probably believed that the men left at Freshwater Bay would never be able to challenge his version of events. When the Speedwell disappeared to the south, David Cheap remained on Wager Island with around 20 men. Cheap still intended to head north. His goal was to reach a Spanish outpost, find a vessel, and if possible, re-establish contact with Anson's squadron. In December 1741, taking advantage of the arrival of summer, the group once again abandoned the island. They departed in a barge and a small auxiliary boat, attempting to travel approximately 300 miles through the channels along the Chilean coast. The plan encountered the same problem that had wrecked the Wager. Headlands, islands, and peninsulas forced the boats to navigate against unpredictable currents. A short distance on the map could require days of rowing just to advance a few miles. During a storm, the auxiliary boat was lost. All the remaining survivors had to fit inside the barge, which did not have enough room. 4 weakened Marines were left ashore with several weapons, tools, and provisions. British records would once again describe the decision as a necessity. By then, necessity had become a remarkably useful word for decisions no one wanted to explain in person. With 14 men packed into the barge, Cheap made several attempts to continue north, but the wind and currents repeatedly drove the vessel back. After weeks without making progress, they gave up. The group returned to Wager Island about 2 months after leaving. They had consumed much of their provisions and were still trapped in exactly the same place. Around 15 days later, several canoes appeared in the channels near the island. They belonged to the Chono, an indigenous people who traveled along the Patagonian coast in lightweight boats and possessed an intimate knowledge of its network of islands, lakes, and passages. The group was led by a man named Martin Oleta. He was surprised to find European survivors on the island, but quickly realized that the remains of the Wager contained something extremely valuable: iron. In the settlements of southern Chile, metal objects were difficult to obtain. The barge, the weapons, the tools, even the nails recovered from the ship could be traded. With the help of the ship's surgeon, who spoke some Spanish, the British negotiated with Oleta. In exchange for the barge, weapons, and iron objects, the Chono agreed to guide the group to the Chiloé archipelago, where Spanish settlements could be found. Guided by Oleta, the group left the island in March 1742. Instead of sailing around the entire Taitao Peninsula, the Chono led the survivors through inland channels and across Lake Presidente Rios. In some sections, the canoes had to be unloaded and carried overland before returning to the water. The difference in preparation was obvious. The environment that was destroying the British was simply part of everyday life for the Chono. The journey to Chiloé lasted approximately 4 months. When they finally reached Spanish-controlled territory, only 4 British survivors remained: David Cheap, Lieutenant Hamilton, and the midshipmen John Byron and Alexander Campbell. They were received as prisoners of war, but were given shelter, food, and far better conditions than anything they had experienced in the channels. They were later transferred to Santiago and remained in Spanish custody until they were eventually able to return to England. Reaching Rio Grande brought the Speedwell's voyage to an end, but it did not take the survivors directly home. They were still in southern Brazil and depended on finding a Portuguese or British vessel willing to carry them to Europe. One of the 30 men who reached Rio Grande, the carpenter William Oram, died shortly afterward. The others remained there for 2 months, recovering and searching for a way to continue their journey. On March 28, 1742, they secured passage aboard the brigantine St. Catherine, bound for Rio de Janeiro. The city offered more transportation options, but the conflicts from the Wager had crossed the continent with them. The boatswain John King gathered several followers and began threatening his former companions. Bulkeley, Cummins, and the cooper John Young eventually abandoned their lodgings and sought protection from the Portuguese authorities. On May 20th, Bulkeley and part of the group left Rio de Janeiro aboard another vessel and sailed to Salvador. They remained in Bahia until September, when they finally secured passage to Lisbon. It was not until December 20th that they boarded the British ship HMS Stirling Castle. On January 1st, 1743, they arrived at Spithead, England, after more than 2 years away from home. Bulkeley had accomplished something extraordinary. He had guided an improvised vessel for more than 1,200 miles, crossed the Strait of Magellan, and brought around 30 men to Brazil. But now, he would have to explain why he had arrested the captain, taken control of the men, and left the island without him. Lieutenant Robert Baines quickly went to the Admiralty and presented his own version of events. His account placed much of the responsibility on Bulkeley and Cummins, while minimizing his own role in the decisions made after the shipwreck. When Bulkeley and Cummins arrived, they were detained aboard the Stirling Castle for 2 weeks. The Navy still did not know whether it was receiving extraordinary survivors or the leaders of a mutiny. With neither David Cheap nor George Anson in England, the Admiralty decided to postpone any trial. Bulkeley was released, but he knew Cheap might still be alive. If the captain returned, he could accuse Bulkeley of mutiny, insubordination, and abandonment. Bulkeley needed to do more than tell his version to the authorities. He needed to make it the version known to the public. He asked the Admiralty for permission to publish his journal. The response was that it was his own concern. In 1743, Bulkeley and John Cummins turned their records into a book about the shipwreck and the voyage of the Speedwell. The struggle for control of the Wager had ended on the island. The struggle for control of the story was only beginning. While the survivors of the Wager struggled to escape the South American coast, George Anson continued the expedition without knowing exactly what had happened to the ship. Her failure to appear at the rendezvous suggested that the Wager had probably been wrecked, but Anson had neither the ships nor the healthy men needed to search for her. The vessels that managed to reach Juan Fernandez Island were also in terrible condition. Hundreds of men had died, primarily from disease and the lack of fresh food. The remaining crews had to be consolidated aboard fewer and fewer ships. Even so, Anson continued attacking Spanish interests in the Pacific. In November 1741, his men captured the port city of Pata in present-day Peru and seized goods, money, and vessels. But the British ships continued to deteriorate. The Trial and the Gloucester were eventually abandoned, and their surviving crews were transferred to the Centurion. By the time Anson crossed the Pacific and reached China, the Centurion was the only ship remaining from his squadron. The Wager had been wrecked. Other vessels had turned back before rounding Cape Horn, and those that continued eventually had to be abandoned. Anson still had not accomplished his primary objective, intercepting one of the galleons carrying wealth between Acapulco and Manila. In April 1743, he left Macau and sailed toward the Philippines, with the expedition's last remaining ship. On June 20th, the lookouts spotted the Nuestra Señora de Covadonga. The Spanish galleon was carrying silver coins and goods from Mexico. The Centurion moved closer and, after approximately 90 minutes of fighting, forced the vessel to surrender. Inside the Covadonga, the British found more than 1.3 million Spanish pesos, along with silver bars and other valuable goods. A single capture had transformed an expedition on the verge of destruction into an extremely profitable victory. Anson took the galleon back to China, sold the vessel, and began the journey home. The Centurion crossed the Indian Ocean, rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and reached England on June 15, 1744. The expedition had lasted 3 years and 9 months, and completed a voyage around the world. Of the roughly 1,900 men who left England, about 500 survived, counting all the groups that returned by different routes. Only 188 came home aboard the Centurion. The captured treasure was paraded through the streets of London, and Anson returned as a hero. The wealth taken from the Covadonga secured his fortune and strengthened his political career within the Royal Navy. The expedition had sailed with several ships and returned with only one, but that one ship was loaded with silver. To the British government, this made a considerable difference in how success was defined. By the time Anson arrived in England, Bulkeley had already published his account. The Admiralty could now begin its investigation into the Wager, but the most important witness was still missing: David Cheap. While Anson returned home as a hero, the 4 survivors who had reached Chiloé remained in Spanish custody. Officially prisoners of war, Cheap, Hamilton, Byron, and Campbell were given food and clothing, and housed with local families. John Byron stayed in the home of a woman and her 2 daughters. According to his account, they became so fond of the young midshipman that they persuaded the governor to delay his departure. After navigating unknown channels, enduring starvation, and surviving a shipwreck, Byron encountered an entirely new obstacle. His hosts did not want to let him leave. In January 1743, the 4 men were sent by ship to Valparaiso. Because Cheap and Hamilton were still recognized as officers, they received better treatment and were taken to Santiago. Byron and Campbell were initially held in a cell, where they became a source of curiosity for the locals. Some residents even paid the guards just to catch a glimpse of the Englishman they had heard so many stories about. The four men were later reunited in Santiago and granted limited freedom. They remained in Spanish custody but were allowed to move around after giving their word that they would not attempt to escape. After Wager Island, it probably felt like a remarkably comfortable form of imprisonment. The group remained in Chile for approximately 2 years. During that time, relations between Cheap and Alexander Campbell deteriorated. Campbell believed he was receiving less money and worse treatment than Byron and Hamilton. When an opportunity arose to return to Europe, he chose to separate from the captain and cross the Andes toward Buenos Aires. Cheap, Hamilton, and Byron boarded a French ship called the Lys. Their first attempt ended quickly when the vessel developed a leak and was forced to return to Valparaiso. On their second departure, they successfully rounded Cape Horn once again, crossed the Atlantic, and reached France. Even after reaching Europe, the journey home remained complicated. The three men spent months in Brest with little money and almost no assistance. Eventually, they secured passage aboard a Dutch ship crossing the English Channel. On April 9, 1745, David Cheap, John Byron, and Lieutenant Hamilton landed at Dover. Of the approximately 20 men who had begun the northern route, only 3 returned to England together. Cheap had survived the shipwreck, the isolation, 2 attempts to escape the island, and years in Spanish custody. But when he returned, he discovered that Bulkeley had arrived 2 years earlier, published his journal, and presented the public with a version of events in which Cheap appeared violent and incompetent. Bulkeley had not simply arrived first. He had turned his defense into a book. Cheap immediately traveled to London and submitted his account to the Admiralty. His survival completely changed the situation for the men of the Speedwell. While they believed the captain was dead, Bulkeley's was the only version anyone could hear. Now the man they had arrested and left behind on the island was back, and prepared to accuse them of mutiny. Bulkeley had a 2-year head start, and a printing press. Cheap had 3 witnesses, and a considerable amount of resentment. England finally had both sides of the story. Bulkeley's version was essentially this. Cheap had sailed the Wager too close to the coast, lost the ship, killed one of his own men, and then refused to accept the only route that could save the remaining crew. Therefore, arresting the captain and leaving aboard the Speedwell was not mutiny. It was a decision made for survival. Cheap offered a slightly different interpretation. According to him, he had been ordered to sail north, rejoin Anson, and continue attacking Spanish positions. Bulkeley had arrested a Royal Navy officer, seized control of the boats, and abandoned his captain on an island where everyone expected him to die. In other words, Bulkeley said, "We saved the crew." Cheap replied, "You stole my boats." Each survivor had to arrange the facts in a way that would not end with his career destroyed, or with charges of a military crime. Their journals were no longer simple records of the voyage. They became written defenses, produced by men who knew exactly how much was at stake. Other versions continued to emerge. Alexander Campbell published his account in 1747 and used the opportunity to criticize Cheap. Isaac Morris described what happened to the men abandoned at Freshwater Bay. In 1768, John Byron published his own account of the shipwreck. Together, these accounts allow us to reconstruct much of what happened, but none of them was written by a neutral observer. Every author was a witness, a participant, and a potential defendant. On April 15, 1746, the survivors of the Wager were assembled aboard HMS Prince George, anchored at Spithead. After 5 years of shipwrecks, abandonments, and accusations, the Royal Navy would finally decide who had done what. Before the trial, Bulkeley tried to find out what might happen to him. He approached the Admiralty's deputy marshal in a tavern and, without revealing his identity, asked about the men of the Wager. He claimed that one of the survivors was a relative, and that he was concerned about the man's fate. The official replied that he believed Bulkeley and Cummins would be hanged. Bulkeley's response was essentially, "Why? Because we didn't drown?" Then he revealed his identity and was immediately arrested. The witnesses included David Cheap, John Bulkeley, John Cummins, Robert Baines, John Byron, Hamilton, and even John King, who had somehow managed to return to England by a route that was never clearly explained. The Royal Navy found a remarkably efficient way to avoid all of that. The court decided to investigate only the loss of the Wager. Everything that happened after the shipwreck was excluded from the trial. After 5 years of preparing explanations about who had taken command after the wreck, the survivors discovered that the court only wanted to know how the ship had struck the rocks. The decision also prevented Cheap from being questioned in court about the death of Cozzens. Cheap kept his career. Bulkeley escaped a charge of mutiny. The shooting of Cozzens was never tried, and the abandonments remained unanswered. The Royal Navy examined 5 years of chaos and established an extremely convenient cutoff point. The moment the ship sank, everyone stopped being its problem. The trial ended without any convictions, but it left the same question that had first emerged on the island unanswered. Did a captain's authority continue after his ship was gone? For the Royal Navy, leaving that question unresolved created a wonderful possibility. Any crew could simply lose its ship and inform the officers that the chain of command had officially been dismissed by the ocean. In 1747, Parliament passed a new law. Officers would retain their authority after a shipwreck, and sailors could continue receiving their pay under certain conditions. The law could not be applied retroactively. Bulkeley and the others remained free. The verdict said that no one had committed mutiny. The new law essentially said, fine, but next time it will be.